Welcome back to another Lab tutorial. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation about dynamics and dynamic range and dynamic processing. Specifically, we'll be discussing limiters, and we'll compare a limiter and the adaptive limiter found inside of Logic Studio. And we'll discuss their relation to compression and compressors in general. When to use them, when not to use them, how to use them, and we'll share a few pro tips along the way as well. So there's plenty to cover in the next few minutes, but fear not, we're going to keep this a fairly simple lesson. We're going to avoid a lot of the peripheral conversation that usually ends up in some sort of heated debate or difference of opinions. As with compression and many other types of dynamic range processing in general, we could all have many, many years of experience and skills and education and still have difference of opinions when it comes to how to go about certain things. So what we're going to do is just kind of run through the basics of each one of these things. Get you guys up to speed on exactly what it all means. And and then just let you apply those lessons learned in your own projects. All right, so without further ado, let's just go ahead and talk about something incredibly important first off, and that is the overuse of limiters in a lot of music that's being produced today. Now, I understand that some of this is a byproduct of the loudness wars and people trying to crank stuff up and increase their perceived loudness. And I also understand that, there's just a lower level of understanding of what some of these tools are amongst a lot of the really young end of the spectrum of producers. Of course, we all gain more understanding and knowledge about the tools that we're using the more that we use them. So this should be expected. But what we'd like to do is share this information freely today, just so everyone kind of has that same level of understanding about these tools. Okay, so first and foremost, limiters used on the individual tracks in your project, maybe not such a good idea. These are usually reserved for your output strips, usually used in mixing and mastering. And when I say mixing, we're talking about pre-recorded audio. You're certainly not going to get the best results if you have a limiter placed on a live capture recording. And that I say that simply just because of the default settings of most plugins these days. Okay, and most of them will have some type of something present that's going to cause latency. Okay, now you'll see here that there's a lookahead parameter on both the limiter and the adaptive limiter. And lookahead as a feature in general, it causes latency. Okay, so plugins that use lookahead are things that you don't normally want to be using during the recording process. Save that for later. But what you can do, there is a nice little workaround, is that a lot of compressors out there, most stock compressors anyway, have a limiter feature. Okay, now there is no necessarily built-in ISPD or inter-sample peak detection built in, or lookahead. Okay, so it's actually a pretty good limiter to use on an individual track. Okay, hence why it's built into these tools. Okay, now what you want to do for something like this is, by default, most compressors are set up to use root mean square, or RMS, which is basically an averaging algorithm. Okay, so it takes an average of all the peaks in your signal, or thereabouts roughly. But really what you want is peak. Okay, you can set your ratio all the way down to just 1-to-1. So your compressor actually is not doing anything. It's just facilitating this brick wall scenario that you're setting up. So you turn on your limiter, and then here's the next debatable point that I'll bring up, and it'll probably be the last. And that is, what is your limiter threshold? Now, the trend has increasingly moved closer and closer to 0.0 dB. And that's just not a good practice to have. This trend of setting everything to negative 0.1 or less it can really hurt your audio, and you're really not getting a whole lot of benefit from it when compared to a more traditional approach of, say, negative zero point 0.3 decibels. Okay, and the reason I say that is because most of these plugins are modeled after analog gear. Okay, and there are no or very few absolutes in analog gear when it comes to this type of thing. There needs to be a certain amount of time to allow your tools to react, and long story short, you end up clipping. You end up clipping if your limiter threshold is too high. So as a rule of thumb, just negative zero point 0.3 is a great middle ground. Okay, some people prefer a little bit less to give themselves just a touch more headroom, a little bit more cushion. But really, negative zero point 0.3 is spot on perfect for most scenarios. Okay, negative zero point 0.1, you're pushing it because eventually there's going to be some clipping distortion, and it's may or may not be noticeable in the moment, but someone's going to notice it sooner or later, and it's going to be no good. So, so that's how you can get a limiter placed onto an individual track in your project, okay, and not have a lot of latency because of it. All right. Now let's talk about the difference between limiter and adaptive limiter really quick. As you can see, there are differences between these two plugins. The adaptive limiter is the one that I probably use more in my own projects. And it's become a much more common tool for people to be using in their workflows. You can see the input and the output scale. There's a little overmeter here, which will tell you what your highest peak is in real time. It continues running and changing over time. So it's a pretty responsive and dynamic plugin in general. Now, when you look at the traditional limiter, all you're seeing here meter-wise is a gain reduction, okay, which is important, but you can kind of see visually what's happening over here with the adaptive limiter. Okay. Now, the other big difference is the output level is in place of the out ceiling. The release is something that you just don't see on the adaptive limiter. The lookahead is actually quite a bit shorter. It's a much more constrained, a 10 millisecond maximum on the standard limiter versus 200 milliseconds maximum on the adaptive limiter. Something to keep in mind. And where that comes into play are, let's say you have a really long track and there's a really big jump in dynamic range and maybe 1 or 2 points in this song. That's probably going to require a longer look ahead. Okay, you want to give your plugin the chance to properly assess the situation before it responds, and it has a chance to prepare for that big jump. Okay, now you know, if that is the case, if that's the type of project you're working on, then the regular limiter just may not fit the bill for you there. Okay. Shorter sounds, whatnot, that's fine. You can use a regular limiter. The gain is on both of these, but what is not present on the standard limiter versus the adaptive limiter is the input scale. So this scales the input signal, and you should never be above 0 dB, period. But especially with the input side of this scenario. Okay, if you're clipping going into your limiter, then something needs to be taken care of before you start tweaking any parameters inside of that limiter. It's pretty much that simple. Okay, because you're already clipping. And again, as I pointed out before on the compressor up here, is just set your output level at negative 0.3. And if you happen to be using a limiter of any kind, whether it be adaptive or not, and you run into issues with your threshold not being a true brick wall, here's a little trick. Just put in a typical gain plugin. All DAWs have these in their standard utility plugins folder, and set the gain to negative 0.3. And put that as the last plugin on your effects chain for that track, and you should be good to go. So there's a little trick. The other thing that's big difference between these two is the soft knee option in the regular limiter. And the soft knee option just basically means that it's not going to have any kind of activity until the threshold is actually reached. Okay. So it's a subtler approach. It's a little less aggressive. Where without the soft knee option ticked, you're dealing with a hard limiter. It's a hard angle compression. So, all right. So we've talked about our look ahead. Let's talk about remove DC just really quickly. As I mentioned before, you're going to use a tool like this most commonly in mixing and mastering sessions. And again, mixing, we're talking about pre-recorded tracks. So it may not ever really be necessary to have this box ticked if you're using more robust tools that could potentially even be a higher quality. What's a good example? Izotope Ozone, for example. I like to use this suite of tools for mastering. Does a brilliant job. If you haven't ever used it, check it out. And I usually use their remove DC option there. Basically, all this does is apply a high pass filter. One more reason why you don't want to go tossing one of these things onto all of your tracks, because you toss one of these onto a sub track or something, all of a sudden you're affecting the signal that's coming out of there. That's no good. So this may not necessarily even be needed. And then optimal look ahead is actually an analysis readout that's going to be populated once you've played through your track. Okay, so you add your adaptive limiter, you play through part of your track, and then you open your adaptive limiter again, and you look at this, and it says, oh, your optimal look ahead is only 50 milliseconds. So then you crank this down to 50, and you're good to go. And the reason why you want to stick within the range that is needed is again latency. You don't want to have a 200 millisecond look ahead if you only need 20 milliseconds. All right, so. And that's it. That's the big breakdown of limiter versus adaptive limiter and their relationship to compression. Again, if you want to put a limiter on an individual track or sound, go ahead and click the limiter box on one of your basic compressor plugins and use that rather than one of these dedicated limiters, because they have look ahead built in. Okay, you can dial down look ahead, but again, it's kind of a question of how these tools were intended to be used versus what kind of creativity and innovation can you bring to the table when using them in ways that perhaps were unintended by the programmers. Okay, so the more you know about these tools, the better you're going to be able to find your own workarounds and use them to their maximum potential in your own projects. All right. Again, if you have questions, and this goes with all tutorials, leave us a comment below, shoot us an email, holler at us on one of our social platforms like Twitter or Facebook or Google Plus or whatever the heck else you use. And as always, we get all of our tutorial ideas from requests from our community members. So please send us a quick shout out. Say hi. Let us know what you want to learn about. Thanks for tuning in today. We hope that this was helpful, and we hope that we help clear up any kind of confusion that you may have had about any of these things that we touched on today. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you again soon. Cheers.